Della Voss stood in the dust of a dying ranch with a creditor's letter folded against her breastbone, and the first thing the men did was measure her by the strain on the wagon's broken axle. They did not look at her face. They looked at the way the bench sagged under her, and one of them, a lean man with a sunburned neck named Hollis Pruitt, leaned to the man beside him and said something low about how that one mail-order woman would eat the place out from under Caleb Mercer before the cattle ever did. Nobody on that hot September morning would have bet a single thin coin on the wide-bodied stranger climbing down from the wagon. Not one of them guessed that before the first snow she would walk their dead country in the dark and find the thing that grown men had given it up for, or that the soft, rich man who had paid her passage to break a widower would be broken instead by her own 2 hands, in the open street, in front of the whole town that was laughing at her now. She came down off the wagon slow and careful, because a big woman learns young that the world is always waiting for her to stumble so it can laugh. She was broad through the shoulders, soft and round in the face, with a gentle double chin, full at the bust and wide through the hips. 270 pounds of her, if she was an ounce, in a faded blue work dress gone gray at the seams and a canvas apron she had sewn herself. Dark hair pinned up with flour, still dusting one temple from the bread she had baked at the way station 2 days back. She did not apologize for the space she took. She had stopped apologizing a long time ago. The man who came out of the low ranch house to meet her did not smile. Caleb Mercer was somewhere in his late 30s, lean and weathered, and burned down to the bone by a year of hard luck. A brown wide-brim hat pulled low, a holstered revolver riding his hip out of plain habit. There was a black band of mourning sewn crooked on his sleeve, and the way he wore it, like he had forgotten it was there, told her more than anything he could have said. He stopped 6 feet from her and looked at the wagon, then at her, then past her at the road, as if still hoping a different woman might come up it. "You'd be the Voss woman," he said. "Della," she said. "And you'd be Mr. Mercer." "Caleb." He did not offer his hand. "You came a long way for a poor bargain. Before I take you another step down this road, let me ask one small thing of you, friend. If you have ever been counted out before you opened your mouth, judged by the size of you instead of the size of what you can do, then drop the name of your town in the comments below and follow along, because I want to see how far the story of Della Voss travels before we are through. Now back to the dust and the dying grass and the man who did not yet know what had come up his road. Caleb Mercer was not a cruel man. That has to be said plainly, because the cruelty in this story belongs to another. He was only a man who had run out of everything except the stubbornness it takes to keep standing on land that is trying to kill you. A man whose wife and 2 small sons lay under 3 graves he had dug with his own hands on the rise behind the house, dead of a spring fever the Ashford doctor had charged him $11 to fail at curing. The drought had come on the heels of the burying, like it had been waiting for him to be weak. The big creek had thinned through July and gone to a road of white stones by August. The honest, slow death of a watercourse in a dry year. But the spring that fed the high pasture had done something stranger, run strong one week in the middle of August and stopped cold the next, with no weakening between, though Caleb in his grief had not thought to wonder at it. He had had 400 head when Sarah died. He had nearer 360 now, losing more every week, and the ones that lived were turning to rib and hide. And he owed money, $800 to a man named Royce Garrow, who held the note on the Mercer land and the Mercer cattle, and very nearly the Mercer soul, due the 1st of November. And Caleb Mercer did not have it or anything close to it. What he had was a dying ranch, 3 graves, and a black band on his sleeve, and into that, by an arrangement he had not fully understood when he agreed to it, had come Della Voss. She had answered an advertisement, a printed card passed between hands in a Chicago boarding house. A widower in the Montana Territory seeking a capable wife to keep a ranch house. References not required, passage to be paid. She had read it twice, this plain woman of 26, who had buried her own husband 2 years before and worked since in other women's kitchens for other women's wages, and she had thought, a kitchen of my own, a door I do not have to knock on, a man who needs me more than he needs to look at me. She had not thought it would be a paradise. She had only thought it would be hers. What neither of them knew, standing in the dust that first morning, was that the advertisement had not been Caleb Mercer's idea at all. It had been Royce Garrow's, and Royce Garrow had not paid a poor man's passage out of kindness. "Come inside out of the sun," Caleb said finally, because his dead wife would have hauled him by the ear for leaving a guest standing in the heat. And even now, half a year gone, Sarah ran the manners of the house. "There's water in the bucket. It's the last of the good water, so don't waste it." "I won't waste anything you've got," Della said, and she meant it as more than a promise about the water, and he heard that, and he turned away, so she would not see whatever crossed his face. The house was small and clean and grieving, swept but bare. The pots hung where Sarah had hung them, the cradle still in the corner with a quilt folded over its rail that Caleb could not put away and could not bear to look at. Della saw all of it in the first 3 seconds and said nothing about any of it. She set her one carpet-bag down by the door, took off her bonnet, rolled her sleeves up over her heavy forearms, and looked at the cold stove and the empty table, and the man standing in his own house like a guest. "When did you last eat a hot meal, Mr. Mercer?" He had to think about it. That was answer enough. She did not wait for his permission. She found the flour nearly gone, and the salt, and a little bacon grease, and a handful of dried beans, and built a fire in the dead stove with the sure hands of a woman who had cooked her way across a continent. She moved through that small kitchen like she had lived in it for years, and Caleb sat at his own table and watched, and a thing happened in his chest that he did not have a name for and did not want one. When she set the plate down in front of him, biscuits gone golden, beans cooked soft with the last of the bacon, a thing made out of almost nothing, he looked at it for a long moment. "You didn't have to," he said. "A person's got to eat," she said, and sat down across from him with her own plate and bowed her head a moment, and then ate, unhurried, taking up her space at the table like she had a right to it, which she did. He ate every bite. He had not done that in months. When the plate was clean, he sat looking at it, and then he said, "Lo," because the food had loosened something in him, "I should tell you what you come to, so you can go back up that road in the morning, if you've a mind to, and I'd not blame you." He turned the empty fork over. "My wife's on the hill behind the house. Sarah, she went in the spring, of a fever. Took her in 5 days." He stopped. "It took the boys with her, same week, both of them." He said it flat, the way a man says a thing he has not let himself say aloud, and the saying of it cost him, and Della saw it cost him and did not flinch from it. "How old?" she said. Not how sad, not how terrible. How old, as if the boys deserved to be counted. 7 and 4. Something moved in his throat. I dug the 3 graves myself. Ground was hard. I didn't trust another man's hands to do it right. "No," Della said quietly. "You wouldn't." After that I stopped talking much. Didn't seem a reason to. He set the fork down. "And the place is dying on top of it. The water's gone, the cattle are going, and I owe a man in town more money than I'll ever see, due the 1st of November, and I haven't got it nor any way to get it." He looked up at her then plain, ashamed. "That's the whole of the bargain you answered, Della Voss. A grave digger with a dead ranch and a debt. You'd have been told none of it, I expect." Della was quiet a moment, drying her hands. "I was told a widower needed a wife to keep his house," she said. "Nobody mentioned the rest." She hung the cloth. "But I didn't come west for an easy thing. There aren't any easy things where I come from. I came for a thing that was mine." She looked at him steady. "A dying ranch I can stand on. A debt's just a number. Numbers can be answered. And 3 graves on a hill." She paused. 3 graves on a hill mean a man who knows how to love something. That's more than most women get offered. I'll stay the night, Mr. Mercer, and the morning after, and we'll see what the place looks like once somebody's fed it. "There's a smokehouse out back gone to rot," she said a while later, gathering the plates. "And a garden plot somebody loved once, choked with weeds now. And 40 things. Besides that, a house lets go when there's no woman in it and no heart in the man." She said it without sting. "I'll start tomorrow." "You don't have to earn your keep the first night, Della." "I'm not earning anything." She set the plates in the wash water. "I just don't know how to sit in a room and watch a thing fall down. Never learned the trick of it." She looked back at him over her broad shoulder. "Did you?" Caleb did not answer that. There was no answer to it that did not open a door he kept shut. The next morning he woke before light to the smell of bread. He lay still a moment, certain he had dreamed it, because Sarah had baked bread and Sarah was on the hill. And then he heard the scrape of the oven door and the small sounds of a person working quietly so as not to wake him. And he came out into the gray kitchen. And there was Della Voss with flour to the elbows of her blue dress, 2 loaves already gold on the sill, and a third going in, having found the old crock of starter Sarah had kept and fed it back to life overnight. And the whole small house smelled the way a house is supposed to, the way the Mercer house had not smelled since spring. He stood in the doorway and could not speak for a moment. "I found your wife's starter in the cold cupboard," Della said, not turning, reading the silence behind her with the accuracy of a woman who has caused a great many silences in men by simply existing in their kitchens. "It was near dead. I brought it back. I hope I didn't overstep with her things." "No," Caleb said hoarse. "No. She'd have hated to see it die." "That's what I thought." Della closed the oven. "A thing somebody loved oughtn't die just because the somebody did. Seems to me." She wiped her hands on her apron and finally turned and looked at him, plain and steady, and there was no pity in it, which was the kindest thing about it. "Sit. There's coffee, and the first loaf's cool enough to cut." He sat. He ate warm bread in his own kitchen in the gray light with a woman he had known for one day, and somewhere in the simple animal comfort of it, a hard knot in his chest. Pulled tight, since the Sunday he filled in the last grave, eased a single notch, and he did not notice it ease, but Della did, because reading the small eases and tightenings of guarded men was the one fine skill the world had let a fat, plain woman keep. She went to work on the place that day like a flood going to work on a dam. She cleared the choked garden plot, and under the chickweed and thistle found the bones of a good garden, the soil still rich, and put in what the season would take, a late planting of turnips and winter greens. She patched the rotted smokehouse with a borrowed hammer, climbing a ladder that groaned under her, and Caleb, watching from the corral, started toward her 3 times to tell her to come down before she broke her neck, and 3 times stopped because the nails went in straight and the board sat true. And a man learns fast which warnings are needed and which are only the old habit of believing a big woman is always one step from disaster. By the end of the first week, the smokehouse was sound, the garden was in, the house smelled of bread, and Caleb had eaten 3 hot meals a day for the first time since spring, and had begun, without meaning to look for her shape when he came in from the pasture, to feel the wrongness of a room she was not in. He did not examine that. He was not a man who examined things, but it was there. The cattle were the harder problem and the one that mattered, and on the 4th night she sat across the table from him after supper and asked him plain about the water. "Tell me about the spring," she said, "the high one. When did it go?" "August." He turned his cup. "Middle of August." "Slow or all at once?" He looked at her. "Does it matter?" "It might. Did it weaken first, thin out, run muddy, leave the cress wet a while, or did it just stop?" Caleb thought back, too tired to wonder why she wanted it. "Just stopped near enough. Ran one week, didn't the next. I went up and it was dry mud and fallen rock." He shrugged. "Drought. The water table dropped. Everybody says the same. And the creek. July. Same way. Strong, then a trickle, then white stones." He drank. Something in her stillness finally reached him through the exhaustion. "Why are you asking it like that? Exactly when? Exactly how fast?" "What's it matter how fast it went?" He set the cup down. "Gone is gone." "Maybe," Della said, looking into her coffee. "Maybe gone is gone." But she did not believe it, even then, and the next morning, before light, she took a tin cup and a short spade from the lean-to and walked out into the dark to put her hand on the ground, and that was the morning that changed everything, though Caleb slept through the start of it, and did not learn until the spring ran what his strange, quiet wife had been doing on the hillside in the cold. That night, Caleb lay awake in the room he had shared with Sarah, on the side of the bed he had not been able to leave, listening to the strange new sound of another person breathing in his house, on a pallet she had made for herself by the stove because she would not presume. And he thought, "Garrow sent me a good worker." And then, with the bitter laugh of a man who knows his own ruin, "It doesn't matter how good she is. We've got no water. By November, the bank takes it all, her too, and there's not a thing one woman can do about a sky that won't rain." He was wrong about that, wrong about nearly everything that mattered that first night, though it would take him until autumn to learn it, and cost him almost everything before he did. Royce Garrow rode out 3 days later to look at his investment. He came up the road on a fine bay horse, a heavy man going soft in a good wool coat, too warm for the season, the kind of man who has never had to choose between his pride and his dinner. He had a round pink face and small pale eyes and a smile that never reached them, and he ran the bank in Ashford and the freight office and a third of the notes in the county, and he was, though no one yet had the proof of it, the most dangerous man for 40 miles in any direction. Della was at the dry trough in the home pasture when he rode in, hauling the last bucket from the house out to a knot of the worst-off cattle, the heavy bucket dragging her shoulder down, her broad back bent to the work, sweat dark between her shoulder blades. She straightened when she heard the horse and watched the big man come, and something in her went still and careful the way it does in an animal that has learned which hands hit. "Well," Garrow said, looking down at her from the bay, taking her in slow the whole wide size of her, and letting his small smile widen just enough to be an insult. "So this is what $15 of passage buys these days?" "It is," Della said, easy, setting her bucket down and meeting him level, because she had learned long ago that a big woman who flinches teaches a man he can keep hitting. $15 and worth every penny to whoever spent it. You'd be Mr. Garrow. Caleb spoke of you. She let that sit a breath, plain as milk. Says you hold the note, says you're the one sent away for me. Something passed behind Garrow's small, pale eyes. Surprise that the heifer talked, and a flicker of something quicker than surprise that she had set his name next to the note and the advertisement in one breath. Then it was gone, and he looked past her at the gaunt cattle and the cracked mud of the trough, and his smile got warmer, which was the wrong direction, and only Della noticed it was the wrong direction. "I am fond of helping a neighbor in a hard patch," he said. "Mercer, you've made a fine choice in a bride. She'll keep you fed right up to the end." Caleb had come out of the barn. "She's a hard worker, Garrow." "I'm sure she is." Garrow swung down and walked to the trough and looked into it, at the inch of muddy water and the cracking mud below, and Della watched his face and saw the thing she was not supposed to see. The dry trough pleased him. It was there and gone in half a second, a small private satisfaction, like a man checking that a fire he set is still burning. Then it was smoothed away, and he turned and said, all concerned, "It's a hard year, Caleb. The spring's failed, I hear. The creek's gone. It grieves me to see it." He shook his head. "A man could lose everything in a year like this. The note comes due the 1st of November. I do hope the rains come." "The rains'll come," Caleb said. "I'm sure they will," said Royce Garrow, in the voice of a man who knew in his fat, untroubled heart that they would not, and who had taken steps to make certain that even if they did, it would not be enough. He mounted up and looked once more at Della, the long, insulting look, and tipped his hat the wrong way, mocking, and said, "Enjoy your bride, Mercer," and rode out. Della stood in the dust and watched him go, and did not say what she was thinking, because she had been a poor large woman in a hard world long enough to know that a man like that does not get caught by being accused. He gets caught by being watched. So she watched, and what she had seen, in the half a second the dry trough had pleased him, was the first loose thread of a thing she did not yet understand, but had every intention of pulling. But first there was the herd to keep alive, and a sky that gave nothing, and a man who had decided he was already ruined. The next morning, before light, Della Voss walked the land. She did not tell Caleb she was going. She rose off her pallet in the dark, ate a cold biscuit, took a tin cup and a short spade from the lean-to, and walked out into the gray, up through the home pasture and along the dead creek, toward the high ground where the failed spring was, because her father had been a well digger, and he had taught her the one true thing he ever knew. Water has reasons. It does not simply leave. It goes somewhere. And if you are patient and humble and put your hand on the ground will tell you where. She walked the dead creek bed first in the cold blue dark, stopping now and again to crouch down with a grunt and lay her broad palm flat on the white stones. Cold, bone dry, dead a long time. She went on, and where the creek bent around a shoulder of rock below the high pasture in the lowest gravel of the dry channel, she stopped because under her palm the stone was not warm like the others. It was cool. Faintly, stubbornly cool, the way stone is cool when water is moving somewhere not far beneath it. She knelt there a while in the dark with her hand on the ground like a woman taking a pulse. Then she climbed up to the high pasture to find the spring that everyone said had died. The spring was a low stone basin, set in the hillside, ringed with the gray skeletons of the watercress that had grown there when the water ran, bone dry now, just cracked mud and fallen rock. Caleb had said it failed in August. The country said the water table had dropped out of reach, and there was nothing to be done but pray. Della stood at the lip of the dead basin in the first gray light, and the well-digger's daughter in her said quietly, "That is not what a failed spring looks like. A failed spring goes down slow. It weakens, it seeps, it leaves damp mud for weeks before it dies. This basin was bone dry and choked with fallen rock, more than ought to have come off that gentle hillside on its own." She knelt in the dry mud and lifted the stones out of the throat one by one, and they were not light, and her arms burned, and she kept on because under the third layer the mud was darker, and under the fifth it was wet, and she put her hand flat against the cold, wet mud at the bottom and felt faint as a sleeping child's heartbeat, the push of water trying to come up and finding the way stopped against a wall of stone that had no business being there. Someone had filled the spring. Someone had carried rock up to this lonely high basin and packed it down into the throat where the water came up and choked it and walked away and let a man bury his cattle and his hopes and call it a drought. Della knelt in the cold mud with her hand on the strangled heart of the Mercer ranch and understood three things at once, the way you read a landscape in a lightning flash: that the water was not gone, that a man had done this on purpose, and with a cold certainty that settled into her like a stone of her own, exactly which soft pink man it had pleased to see the dry trough. She did not run down the hill shouting, a large, plain woman, newly come to a stranger's ranch, accusing the most powerful man in the county of a crime with nothing but a feeling and some loose rock. They would say she was hysterical, that she was making herself important, and worse besides, about a woman her size. She knew exactly what they would say, so she did the only thing that would ever matter. She started digging the spring out. It took her 4 days. She told Caleb she was clearing the old basin for stock water, which was true as far as it went, and he looked at her like she was wasting strength on a dead thing, but was too tired and too courteous to forbid it. And besides, a part of him liked having her up there, a moving shape on the hillside he could see from the barn, a sign that something on his land still believed in tomorrow. On the third day he climbed up to her at noon with a jar of water and a wedge of the bread she had baked, and he came over the rise and stopped because she was not idly clearing rock. She was down to her waist in the throat of the spring, her blue dress black with mud, lifting out broken stones and laying them in a careful row on the bank, set in courses, sorted, the way a person sorts evidence, and Caleb looked at that row of sorted stone and felt the first cold finger of understanding touch the back of his neck. "Della, what are you doing?" She straightened, breathing hard, and pushed a wet strand of hair off her face with her wrist, and looked at him a moment, weighing whether it was time. Decided it was not, quite, not until she had the whole of it. "Clearin' your spring," she said. "That's broke stone." He crouched and picked one up off her sorted row, turned it in his hand. "Quarried. This didn't fall off this hill." "No," Della agreed carefully. "It didn't." For a moment the whole of it hung in the noon heat between them, unsaid, and she watched him almost reach it, almost ask the question that would have changed the next 4 days, and then the grief in him pulled him back from the edge of hope, the way it had pulled him back from everything, and he set the stone down and said, low and tired, "Don't break yourself on a dead thing, Della. There's no water in this hill. There hasn't been since August. I watched it die." And he set the bread and the jar on a rock and went back down the hill, and Della watched him go and did not call after him, because some things a person has to be shown, not told, and she bent back to the stone and dug, and decided she would not say one word until the water itself said it for her. She drank his water, she ate his bread, she worked till dark. She worked from before light to full dark, lifting stone, hauling mud, her blue dress black with it to the elbows and the knees, her great arms shaking by the end of each day, and on the evening of the 4th day she pulled the last wedged stone out of the throat of the spring and stepped back, and the water came. It came slow at first, a dark welling in the cleared mud, then steady, a turning and a brightening, and then it ran clear and cold over the lip of the old basin and down the channel toward the dead creek for the first time since August, and Della stood there filthy and exhausted and watched it run, and did not whoop or cry. She put her muddy hand over her mouth and laughed, once, low, the laugh of a woman who has been told her whole life that she cannot, watching the proof that she can. Then she walked down the hill in the dark to fetch the man who had decided he was ruined. Mr. Mercer. She stood in the doorway of the house, and he looked up from the table where he sat doing nothing in the lamplight, and the sight of her, mud to the elbows, soaked, swaying a little on her feet with the day's work, brought him half out of his chair. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Come up the hill," she said. "Bring a lantern." "It's full dark, Della." "Bring a lantern," she said again, gently, and there was something in her voice that got him up and moving, and they walked up through the home pasture in the lantern light, the heavy woman and the lean, grieving man, and the cattle in the dark lifted their heads as they passed and began on their own, with no one driving them to follow. Caleb noticed it before she said a word. The cattle were following them up the hill, 360 head of thirsty cattle turning out of the dry home pasture in the dark and walking toward the high ground, because on the night air from a mile off they could smell what their nostrils had not smelled in a month and a half. "Della," Caleb said, and his voice had gone strange. "Why are they following us?" "Because they can smell it," she said. He came over the last rise behind her, lantern up, and the light fell on the old stone basin brimming full, the clear water spilling down the channel and pooling silver, and below it the first of the cattle were already shouldering each other aside to get their muzzles into the running water. Caleb stood at the top of his own hill with the lantern shaking in his hand and looked at the water the whole county had told him was gone forever, and for a long moment he could not speak at all. "It failed," he said finally, hoarse. "In August it went dry. I watched it go dry." "It didn't fail," said Della Voss. "Somebody filled it." She crouched at the basin's edge and lifted out one of the stones she had set aside, a fist of gray rock, and held it up into the lantern light. "Spring rock comes up rounded and smooth. This is broke stone, quarried stone. Somebody hauled this up here a load at a time and packed your spring shut and let you think the sky did it." She set the stone down. "Your spring's been murdered, Mr. Mercer, and I dug it back up." Caleb looked at the broken stone, and at the drinking cattle, and at the woman crouched filthy and exhausted at the edge of the water she had freed with her own 2 hands, and something he had held clenched since the 3 graves cracked and let go, and he sat down hard on a rock with the lantern in his hands, and put his other hand over his eyes, and his shoulders moved, and Della did him the kindness of looking at the cattle and not at him while he wept. When he could speak again, he said the thing that mattered. "Who?" And Della, watching the water run silver in the dark, said the name she had been holding for 4 days. "Who came out here glad to see your trough dry, Mr. Mercer? Who holds your note and your land, and pays a poor woman's passage out west, and tells you it grieves him to watch you fail?" Caleb was quiet a long while. The cattle drank. "Garrow," he said. "Garrow," she agreed. "You can't prove that. A man can't accuse Royce Garrow of a thing like that without—" "No," Della said. "Not yet. So we don't. We say nothing. We let him think the drought's still killing you. We water your cattle quiet up here where the road can't see, and we fatten them back up, and we keep our mouths shut, and we wait for him to come close enough to catch." She stood, her knees cracking, and looked down at the lean man on the rock. "A man who'd choke a spring will do worse before he's through. Patient does it. We be patient, Mr. Mercer, and we keep this water a secret as long as we can." Caleb Mercer looked up at her in the lantern light. This woman Garrow had sent to break him. This woman the whole county was already laughing at. This 270 pounds of competence and quiet steel that had walked his dead land in the dark and found the thing that would save it. And he said, slow, like a man learning a new word, "You're a deal smarter than I bargained for, Della Voss." "Most folks find that out too late to apologize for it," she said, and almost smiled, and they walked the cattle down to water in the dark. That was the turning, though neither of them called it that. After the night of the spring, the ranch began, very quietly, to come back to life. They moved the herd up to the high pasture away from the road, where the freed spring ran cold and steady, and the watered grass came back green in patches that spread wider every week. Della rigged a second channel to carry the overflow down to a hidden bench where Caleb's father had once grown hay, lining it with the same broken stone that had strangled the spring, turning the weapon back into a tool, and the rib and hide cattle that had been days from dying put on flesh through October, like the country had never tried to kill them. Caleb worked beside her. He had not worked beside anyone since Sarah, and at first stiffly and then easily, and then gladly, and he caught himself one cold morning at the new channel, knee-deep in mud beside her, the two of them passing stones hand to hand in a rhythm they had fallen into without deciding to, and realized he had laughed out loud at something she said the first time since the spring took his family. And the sound surprised him so badly he stopped and stood there with a stone in his hand. Della looked at him. "What? Nothing," he said. And then, because she had earned the truth, "I forgot I could do that." She did not make it into a moment. She knew how a big woman handing a man a tender feeling can watch him take fright and run. So she only nodded and said, "It comes back," and held out her hand for the next stone, and the work went on. And that was its own kind of tenderness, the kind that does not announce itself. One evening in that good stretch, with the herd fattening and the secret water holding, Caleb stood at the new channel and finally asked the thing he had wondered since the night of the spring. How'd you know they'd smell the water that first night? From a mile off in the dark. How'd you know? Della straightened from the channel and wiped her hands. "A thirsty cow is a better water witch than any forked stick a man ever cut," she said. "You can't fool a thirsty animal about water, Mr. Mercer. It hasn't got the pride to pretend the way people do. It just goes where the water is." She nodded out at the herd, drinking. "That's how I knew Garrow choked the spring instead of the sky drying it. The cattle never gave up on this hill, even dying of thirst. They kept drifting back up here and standing confused, smelling water they couldn't reach." She shrugged her broad shoulders. "Animals don't stand confused over nothing. They knew the water was there, they just couldn't get to it through his rock. All I did was believe them." And Caleb looked at the woman who had solved his ruin by believing his cattle when he himself had given up, and thought there was a kind of smartness the world had no name for and no respect for, and that she had more of it than any man he had ever met. But the town did not know about the spring, and so the town went on the way it had begun. They went into Ashford for supplies in the first week of October, and Della felt the town's eyes the way she always felt them, the quick measuring looks, the women murmuring at the dry goods counter, the men at the saloon rail turning to watch the wide woman on the Mercer wagon and saying their small, cruel things. Hollis Pruitt, the lean hand from that first morning, was lounging at the rail with two others, and as the wagon passed he said loud enough to carry, "There goes Mercer and his prize heifer. Reckon Garrow sent him a wife by the pound." The two men beside him laughed. Caleb went stiff on the bench, his hands tightening on the reins, his jaw working, and Della put her hand flat on his forearm, not gripping, just resting, and said low, "Leave it. He's got no call. He's got every call he wants and no facts at all," Della said. "A man like that talks because his hands are empty. Let him." And she looked straight ahead and let the wagon roll on past the rail, her broad face calm, and did not give Hollis Pruitt the satisfaction of seeing the words land. And that was a harder thing than digging the spring, and Caleb, who had been ready to climb down and ruin himself over it, watched her do it and learned something about courage that had nothing to do with fists. They tied up at the mercantile, and Della went in for the flour and salt and coffee, and the women at the counter drew their skirts and murmured the way they always did, and Della paid it no more mind than the weather, until a thing happened that began, in its small way, to turn the wind. A girl of about 9, the storekeeper's daughter, had got her arm caught in the heavy crank of the bolt-cloth cutter behind the counter, and the clumsy iron thing had come down and pinned her small forearm, and she screamed, and her father, a thin, nervous man, panicked and hauled the crank the wrong way and made her scream worse, and the women at the counter fluttered and were no use to anyone, and Della set down her flour and crossed behind that counter, fast and certain, and put one big hand flat on the iron crank and the other on the man's shaking wrist. "Stop pulling," she said, low and even, the voice she used on frightened cattle. "You're driving the iron down. Let go." "I've got it." And the man let go, because the voice gave him no choice, and Della eased the crank back the way it had come, slow and gentle, taking the weight of the iron on her own broad shoulder, and the cutter lifted off the little arm clean, and she had the girl up onto the counter and was running her careful fingers down the small forearm before the child had stopped crying. "It's not broke," she said to the white-faced father. "Bruised bad, and it'll color up ugly, but the bone's whole. See, she can close the hand. A broke arm won't close the hand." She gentled the sobbing girl. "There now. You're all right. That's a brave girl. You held still better than your pa did." And the child, startled, laughed through her tears, and the women at the counter went quiet, and the storekeeper looked at the fat stranger who had come over his counter and known exactly what to do when he had lost his head, and he did not know what to say, so he said the truest thing. "Thank you, ma'am. I didn't know what to do. Thank you." "A person learns," Della said, and gathered her flour and paid, and the storekeeper would not take her money for the coffee, and she let him keep that small dignity and went back out to the wagon. Caleb had seen the whole of it through the open door, and he handed her up onto the bench in a silence that was full of something, and as they pulled away, he said, low, "You doctored that child like you'd done it 100 times." "I have," Della said simply. "Poor women are everybody's doctor, Mr. Mercer. There's never money for a real one. You learn bones and fevers and burns, or the children around you die. So, you learn." And Caleb drove the wagon home, thinking that he had been sent by a man who meant to ruin him, a woman who dug dead springs back to life and set a child's arm without flinching, and he could not for the life of him understand how the whole world had looked at her and seen only the size of her, and thought the world might be a great deal more foolish than it believed itself to be. Word of the storekeeper's daughter went around Ashford, too, quieter than the cruel words, but steadier. And a few of the women who had drawn their skirts began, when the Mercer wagon passed after that, to nod. But the cruelty in Ashford had a source, and the source sat in the bank with his soft white hands folded on his desk, and when Caleb went in to ask, as a starving man must, whether Mr. Garrow might extend the note a month past November, Royce Garrow leaned back in his chair and smiled his smile that did not reach his eyes and said, "No. It grieves me, Caleb. It truly does. But a note's a note." He spread his soft hands. "The 1st of November, $800, principal and interest, or the land, the cattle, the buildings, and—" The smile widened a fraction. The rest of the household, I suppose, comes to the bank. I'd be doing you a kindness to take that woman off your hands, the way the year's gone. She'll have eaten you to the bone by spring." Caleb's face went white and still. "You leave her out of your mouth, Garrow." Now. Garrow's eyes flicked up, sharp under the soft. "No call for heat. We're businessmen." He came around the desk and put a heavy, soft hand on Caleb's shoulder and walked him toward the door, his voice gone low and warm and poisonous. "I'll tell you plain, because I'm fond of you. There's no rain coming. There's no money coming. There's no miracle coming, Caleb. The land's done. Sign it over quiet before the first, and I'll see you're treated fair. A little something for the road, a fresh start somewhere the ground's kinder. Don't make me take it ugly in front of the whole county. Be smart." The hand patted twice. "Be smart, and be quick." And Caleb Mercer, who knew now that the spring had been murdered, who knew now that this soft, warm hand on his shoulder had carried the rock that murdered it, stood very still under the weight of that hand and understood that Garrow did not yet know about the water. Garrow thought he was watching a man drown. Garrow was already spending the land in his mind. "I'll think on it," Caleb said, in a voice that gave nothing away, and walked out, and did not let his hand shake until he was past the window. He told Della that night, at the table, low, the lamp turned down. "He offered me a little money to sign it over quiet before the first. Says the land's done. Says he'd be doing me a kindness." Caleb turned his coffee cup around and around. "He doesn't know about the spring." "No," Della said. "He doesn't. That's the only card we've got, and we keep it face down." She was quiet a moment, working it. "How much do you owe him, all told?" "The true number?" $800, principal and the interest he's piled on." "And what's a fat steer worth at the railhead in Cheyenne this fall?" brought in Sound. Caleb looked at her. $30 a head, maybe more for prime." "Why?" Della Voss folded her hands on the table, the big, capable hands, and there was a light in her round face that he was coming to know and to wait for, the light that meant she had seen the whole landscape in a flash again. "Then we don't beg him for time, and we don't sign his paper," she said. "We save the herd he thinks is dying, and before the month is out, we drive every Sound steer you've got to the railhead, and we sell, and we walk into that bank on the 1st of November, and we lay $800 on his polished desk, and we pay the note in full." She let that sit. "And we watch his face while we do it." Caleb stared at her. "Drive cattle to Cheyenne, the two of us, 300 head. That's a 6-day drive across open country, Della. That's a thing outfits hire a dozen men for. We can't do it the two of us," she agreed. "So we hire quiet, honest men who hate Garrow as much as we've got cause to, and there's no shortage of those in a county he's got his thumb on. We pay them out of the sale. We move fast, and we move quiet, and we're gone before he knows the herd's not dead." She leaned forward, and her voice dropped, and the steel in it was bare now. "He bet a year of your life that he could starve you off this land cheap. We're going to take that bet, Mr. Mercer, and we're going to make him pay for the privilege." And Caleb, looking across the lamplit table at the woman the whole county had sold him as a burden, felt something he had not felt since before the graves on the hill. He felt like he might win. He reached out slow and put his weathered hand over her big mud-roughened one, the first time he had ever touched her on purpose, and said nothing, because he did not have the words, and she did not need them, and Della looked down at his hand on hers and did not pull away. They began to plan the drive. The hiring was Della's to do, and she did it plainly and without waste, riding out over 3 cold days to the scattered places of the men Garrow had hurt. Caleb gave her the names, and she went up to one hardscrabble homestead after another, and sat in their cold kitchens and drank their thin coffee and looked their tired wives in the eye. And she did not promise them justice, because justice does not always come, and a careful woman does not sell it. She promised them wages and honest work, and let the rest go unsaid until the men said it themselves. At the first place, the Becker homestead, the young man, Tom Becker, stood by his door with his hat in his hands and listened to her lay it out, the drive, the wages, 6 days to Cheyenne, and he was quiet a while, and then he said, looking at the dirt, "Garrow took my pa's bottom 40 on a note he juggled. Pa never got over it, died owing to man." He looked up. "You're saying we drive Mercer's cattle to Cheyenne so he can pay Garrow off in front of the whole town." "I'm saying that," Della said, "and get paid for it." "I'd do it for nothing," Tom Becker said. "I know," said Della. "That's why I'm paying you double. A man who'd do it for nothing is the only kind worth paying double." And the young man looked at the fat, plain stranger in his cold kitchen, and something settled in his face, and he said he was in, and his 2 younger cousins with him, and that was 3. The 4th was Esau, and him she went to last and alone, because Esau was not a man who could be hired with wages. She rode up to his low place 2 ridges over in the failing light, and found him mending a hackamore on his porch. And she did not get down off the mare, because a person did not presume into Esau's yard, and she said only, "Mr. Mercer's driving his herd to Cheyenne to pay off Garrow and buy back his life. I'm short a real hand. Everybody I've asked is a homesteader. I need one man who's actually moved cattle." Esau did not look up from the hackamore for a while. Then he said, "Why's Garrow want Mercer broke so bad? Lots of men owe him." "He doesn't choke springs for all of them." Della went still on the mare. "How'd you know about the spring?" Now Esau looked up. His dry creek bed face gave away nothing. "I read ground for a living, woman. I've been past that high pasture. A failed spring doesn't leave a hill bruised like that one's bruised." He set the hackamore down. "Somebody dug there, recent, and somebody dug it back out, more recent, and not gentle." He looked at her hands on the reins, the big mud-roughened hands. "That'd be you?" "That'd be me." The old man studied her a long moment in the last of the light, and something in him, some judgment he had reserved his whole life from soft white people who measured him by his blood the way they measured her by her weight, shifted a 1/4 inch. "I'll drive your cattle," Esau said. "Not for the wages. I'll take the wages, but not for them." He picked the hackamore back up. "I want to be standing in that street when somebody finally tells Royce Garrow no. 15 years I've been waiting to see a man's face do that. I'll drive to Cheyenne and back for a front-row seat at it." He nodded her off his land, not unkindly. "Be light when you start. Frost makes them want a bunch." And Della rode home in the dark with her 4 men hired and the bones of a thing assembling under her, and she did not yet let herself believe it would work. But she let herself, for the first time, believe that it might, and she carried it carefully, the way you carry a coal. But there is a thing about a man like Royce Garrow, and Della knew it, and it kept her up in the cold, dark hours before light. A man who would choke a spring is not a man who waits patiently for the first of the month. A man who does that small evil in secret has a larger one he is building toward, and will not sit quiet and let the calendar do his work if there is faster work he can do himself. She had pulled one loose thread, and had the crawling certainty that the strangled spring was not the worst thing Garrow had done to the water on the Mercer land, only the first thing she had found. She found the second thing on the morning of the 11th of October, and it nearly killed the herd, and it was very nearly the end of everything. She had gone up to the high pasture before light, as she did every morning now, and the cattle were wrong. She knew it. Before she was halfway up the hill, they were not grazing. They stood in a strange, uneasy huddle at the lower end of the bench, away from the new water she had run down for them, and 3 of them were down in the grass on their sides, legs out, and one of those was not moving at all. Della ran. A woman her size does not run easily, and she ran anyway, her heavy body laboring up the slope, her breath tearing, and she dropped to her knees beside the nearest downed steer, a young red one, alive but barely, its eyes rolled white, foam at its black lips, and she put her face close to its muzzle and caught the smell on its breath, a sharp chemical wrongness, a sweetish poison reek that did not belong on any honest range. And the well-digger's daughter knew it for what it was, the way she had known the broken stone. The water. Somebody had got into the water. She was on her feet and running along the new channel before she had finished the thought, and she found it where the channel ran close to the road below the high pasture, where a man could come up unseen in the night. The bank freshly dug and packed back, the grass disturbed and half buried in the soft, new earth, 3 empty stoneware crocks, the kind that hold the sheep dip and rat poison of freight office cells. Della tipped one, and the last white grit ran into her palm and stung where the sweat was, and she flung it down and stood there in the gray dawn shaking with a rage so cold it frightened her. He had poisoned the water, come up in the night, and fed his poison into the spring she had saved upstream of the cattle, where it would foul the bench and kill the herd and leave Caleb Mercer with nothing to sell and no choice but to sign. He could not have known how the water had come back. He surely did not know a mail-order bride had clawed his rock out of the spring's throat 1 stone at a time. But he had seen the green spreading on the high hillside, or marked the cattle drifting up off the dead home pasture, and a man who has murdered a spring once knows at a glance when someone brings it back, and he had reached up into the dark and tried to murder it a second time, the herd along with it, and he had very nearly done it. Della did not waste a heartbeat on the rage. She ran back to the channel head and threw her whole great weight against the stone she had set there, breaking her own dam, cutting the poisoned bench off from the clean spring above, and then she ran down the hill screaming for Caleb, and he came out of the barn at a dead run with the dawn just breaking, and what followed was the worst day of work either of them had ever done. They shoved the nearest of the herd back from the fouled water by hand, the 2 of them and nothing else, shouting and weeping, before more of them drank, and Della knelt over the downed ones and did the only thing her childhood had taught her, forcing clean water down their throats and working their flanks, the young red steer's head in her lap, a great woman crouched in the dirt with a dying animal in her arms, talking to it low and steady, while Caleb rode for the only honest animal doctor he knew, the old half-crow horsebreaker Esau, 2 ridges over, who had no love at all for Royce Garrow. She did not know yet how many she would lose. That was the worst of it, kneeling there with the red steer's head in her lap and its breath going ragged. Not the knowing, but the not knowing. The long hours of it, each downed animal, a coin she could not yet count won or lost. She forced the clean water down and worked the slack flank and talked low into the twitching ear, and she said to the steer and to nobody, "Not you. You hear me. Not you. He doesn't get you, too." The morning wore on toward noon like that, her on her knees in the fouled grass, moving from one downed steer to the next, and some of them came up under her hands, swaying and drunk and alive, and some of them did not, and she could not stop for the ones that did not, because the living one still needed her. And so she went on, and somewhere in the going on she stopped letting herself feel the count at all. By the time Caleb came back at a hard gallop with Esau on a lathered pony beside him, the worst of it was nearly done. They swung down at the poisoned bench, and Esau crouched over the nearest downed steer, lifted its lip, smelled its breath, and went gray under his brown. "That's not sickness," he said. "That's poison in the water. Somebody fed it in." He looked up the channel toward the disturbed bank. "Up there." "I know," Della said from her knees. "I found the crocks." The old man's eyes went flat and old and dangerous. "Then we work fast and grieve later," he said, the only comfort he had to give. And it was the right one. And Caleb knelt in the mud beside Della, where she had the young red steer's head in her lap, soaked and shaking, forcing clean water down its throat a swallow at a time, and put his hand on her broad, shaking back. "Della, I cut the channel," she got out. "Above the foul water, I broke my own dam. The clean spring's still good. It's just this stretch, just the bench, where he fed it in. We can save the rest if we move them now, all of them, up to the high water." "Then we move them now," Caleb said, and his voice was steady, because hers was not, and that was the first time in the whole story it went that direction, the man steadying the woman, and she felt it, the hand on her back, and the steadiness in it, and she got up out of the mud, and they went and did the thing together. It took the 3 of them the rest of that day to drive the herd off the poisoned bench and up to the clean upper water without losing more. Cattle do not like to leave water once they have found it, even bad water, and they balked and milled and broke, and Della stood in the worst of the gaps on foot, a great immovable shape in a soaked blue dress, turning steers with nothing but her own bulk and a low voice that did not crack, though everything in her was cracking, and the cattle, who had learned that this shape meant the good water, parted around her and went up. Esau, watching her hold a gap a mounted man would have struggled to, said nothing, but watched. They lost 6 head, 6 out of 356. Della laid her hand on each one as it went and did not look away, because she had decided someone ought to grieve the things that man killed, since the man never would. And toward evening, when the young red steer she had nursed heaved up onto its trembling legs and walked on its own to the clean upper water and drank, she sat down in the grass at last and let herself cry, the long, shaking cry of a person who has held a thing together past the point a person can and Caleb sat down beside her and did not tell her to stop and did not say it would be all right, but only stayed. Esau, the horse-breaker, crouched a little apart and looked at the crock she had dug up and turned one over in his brown hands and smelled it and set it down. He was an old man with a face like a dry creek bed and eyes that missed nothing, and he looked from the crocks to the disturbed channel bank, to the dead cattle, to the weeping woman and the steadying man. And he said in his slow, careful English, "Freight office in Ashford sells this. Garrow's freight office." He set the crock down gentle, like evidence, which it was. "Only one outfit in this county buys it by the crock." He looked at her. "You going to do something about that, or you going to cry?" Della Voss wiped her face with the back of her muddy hand and stood up. "Both," she said, "but the doing first." And she picked up the 3 crocks, and she wrapped them in her apron, and she carried the proof down the hill, because the loose thread had finally come all the way out, and what it had unraveled was a hanging matter. Now there was evidence. 3 poisoned crocks from Garrow's own freight office, 6 dead cattle, a fouled channel, a strangled spring full of quarried stone, and the testimony of an honest old horsebreaker who could read the ground. It was enough to take to the law. The trouble was that the law in Ashford was the county sheriff, a fat, comfortable man named Dwyer, who owed Royce Garrow money and favors and his very chair. And Della knew, the moment she thought of it, that taking the crocks to Dwyer would be like taking them straight to Garrow. "We can't go to Dwyer," she said that night. "The crocks lined up on the table between them in the lamplight, terrible little jars. He's Garrow's. He'd lose the evidence by morning and have us up for slander by noon." "Then there's no law that'll touch him," Caleb said, low and bitter, turning the dead steers over and over in his mind. "He owns the law in this county. He's owned it for years. That's how he's done all of it." "The county law?" Della said slowly, and there was the light again, faint, the landscape coming clear. "Not the only law there is." Caleb looked at her. "My first husband worked the railroad," Della said, "before the cholera took him. And I learned a thing from the men he worked with, sitting at my own table listening, which is the only schooling a woman like me ever gets." She laid her hand flat on the table beside the crocks. "Poisoning the water of a public range, fouling a watercourse that runs off into the Crooked Fork and on down past 3 other outfits and a town's wells, that's not a county matter, Mr. Mercer. Water crosses lines. Where water goes, the federal land office and the territorial marshal can follow, and Royce Garrow does not own them. He can't. They're too far up the river for his thumb to reach." She tapped the table once. "We don't take this to Dwyer. We take it past him. We send for a federal man. That'd take weeks. A letter to the territorial seat and back. Then we send it tonight," Della said, "and we keep the herd alive and quiet for the weeks it takes, and we make our cattle drive and pay the note on the first so Garrow can't take the land out from under the proof, and we hold our nerve, all of us, until the federal man rides into Ashford and we hand him 3 crocks and an honest witness and watch Royce Garrow's soft pink face come apart in front of the whole county. He's been bleeding." She stood and lit a second candle and got out paper and the stub of a pencil. "I'll write it. I've a fair hand when the cause is good." And she sat at the table half the night and wrote, in her careful, schooled by eavesdropping hand, a letter to the office of the United States Land Agent at the territorial seat, laying out plain the strangled spring, the quarried stone, the poisoned channel, the crocks from the Ashford freight office, the dead cattle, and the note held by the same man who profited from every drop of it. And she signed it not Caleb Mercer, but Della Voss, because, she said when Caleb objected, a man they can dismiss as a debtor with a grievance, a woman they'll think too simple to invent a lie this size. Let them underestimate me. It's the only thing being underestimated is ever good for. And she sealed it, and Caleb rode through the night to put it on the eastbound mail, and they began the longest 2 weeks either of them had ever lived. The night before they pointed the herd south, Caleb found her at the corral in the dark, checking the cinches by feel, and stood beside her a while before he said it. "If this goes wrong," he said, "if we lose the herd on the trail, or the price has fallen, or he gets a federal friend of his own, you walk away clean. You hear me? You took no paper on this debt. It's mine." Della went on working the leather. "It's ours," she said. "I didn't dig a spring out of the dark and nurse your herd back off the poison to walk away clean when the last hand gets dealt." She tested a buckle. "Anyhow, it won't go wrong. You can't know that." "No." She turned and looked at him in the starlight, plain and steady. "But I know the water's real, and the cattle are sound, and the men are honest, and the man we're driving against thinks he's already won. That's 4 true things, Mr. Mercer, I've built whole lives on less." She picked up the lantern. "Get some sleep. We start light." Start. Frost makes them want to bunch. Esau said so, and Esau's never wrong about a cow. And Caleb, who an hour before had been lying awake, counting the ways it could end with him standing in that Bank Street ruined, slept that night like a man with 4 true things under him. Here is where Della's planning showed its worth, for she had built the whole thing backward from the 1st of November and left no day to spare. They could not drive until the herd was sound, and it was not sound until the poisoned ones had recovered and the rest had grass fattened. So the drive began on the 20th of October, in a cold dawn with frost on the dead grass, 350 head pointed south toward the Cheyenne railhead, 6 hard days away, driven by Caleb and Della and 4 quiet, hard men out of the county store of Garrow's enemies, Esau chief among them, and 3 homesteaders Garrow had squeezed and nearly broken, who would have driven those cattle for nothing but the chance to spit in the wind that blew from his direction and took her wages besides. Della rode the drive. She had not sat a horse in years, and she climbed up onto a broad, patient mare that first morning, with her face set against the certainty the men would laugh. And not one of them laughed, because they had seen the spring she dug and the crocks she carried down the hill. A thing had happened in that county she did not yet know about. The honest men had begun to talk about her not the way Hollis Pruitt talked, but the way men talk about someone they have decided, against all their own habits, to follow. Those 6 days on the trail were the making of them. There is no hiding what a person is on a cattle drive, and Della Voss stood up in it. She rode drag in the worst of the dust without complaint, and cooked for 6 hungry men over a buffalo chip fire, and they ate like they never had. And the shy young Tom Becker set into the firelight on the 3rd night, looking at his cleaned plate. "Ma'am, I'd marry you myself if you weren't took." And the whole camp laughed, and it was not a cruel laugh. It was the first time in Della's life that men had laughed warm at her instead of cold. And she laughed too, and across the fire Caleb watched her and let himself feel at last the thing in his chest that had no name. Later that 3rd night, with the herd bedded and the fire down to coals and most of the men rolled in their blankets, Esau sat across the embers from her, oiling a bridle, and he said, without looking up, "Where'd a town woman learn to read a hill the way you read that one?" Della was banking the fire for morning. "Wasn't always a town woman," she said. "My pa dug wells all down the low wet country before he drank himself out of the trade and then out of his life. He used to take me along when I was small enough to ride in the barrow with the tools." She set a last stick on the coals. "He'd put my hand flat on the ground and ask me what I felt, and I never felt a thing, not for years. And he'd just say, 'Feel again, Della. The ground's not in a hurry, and neither are we.' And then one day I felt it, the cool of it, the pull. After that I couldn't not feel it." She wiped her hands. "It's the only thing he ever gave me that the drink didn't take back. That, and a wide enough frame that nobody's ever knocked me down." Esau was quiet a while, working the leather. "My grandmother read water," he said finally. "Crowside walked a creek bed once a year and told the band where to winter. White men came and called it superstition and dug their wells by a forked stick and wondered why they went dry." He looked at her across the coals, the old half-crow face giving up the ghost of something that on another man would have been a smile. "Two kinds of people the world's decided can't know anything, and here we both are, knowing where the water is." He went back to the bridle. "Funny old country." "It is," said Della, and that was the whole of it. Two people the world had written off sitting easy at a dying fire, each of them holding the one thing the world swore they could not have. And across the camp, Tom Becker, who was not asleep, lay listening and thought he had never in his life heard grown people talk so plain, and decided, lying there, that wherever the big Voss woman went after this, he would think well of her till he died. On the fourth night the trouble came that every drive fears, and it came in the dark, and it tested every one of them, and Della most of all. A cold rain blew in off the mountains after midnight, hard and slanting with thunder walking behind it, and the herd, already strange in a strange country, came up off its bedding ground, uneasy and milling. Caleb felt it before he heard it, the change in the sound of the cattle, the low, uncertain moan of a herd thinking about running, and he was up and into the saddle with his heart in his throat, because there is nothing on the frontier worse than a stampede in the black, and they were 6 riders against the whole weight of it. "Ride the edges," Esau shouted over the rain, already moving, an old shape going out into the dark on a horse that knew its work. "Sing to them. Don't let them get a leader. Turn the front if it breaks." They strung out around the milling herd in the streaming dark, 6 small human shapes against a black moving mountain of frightened animals, and they sang to them, every man and the one woman, the old tuneless songs you sing to cattle, not for the words, but for the steady human sound of it under the thunder. And for a while it held, the herd milling but not breaking, and then a clap of thunder came down close and white, and the whole herd surged, and a knot of 40 steers tore loose off the south face and ran. "They're breaking south," Tom Becker screamed. "They're breaking—" And Della Voss, who had been holding the south edge because it was the near edge to camp, and they had thought it the safe one, was the only rider between 40 stampeding steers and the open black plain. She did not freeze. A lifetime of being expected to fail in front of people had burned the freeze out of her years ago. What was left in the crisis was a terrible plain steadiness. She turned the mare straight into the path of the running cattle, a great immovable shape in a streaming dress. And she did not try to stop them, because you cannot stop them, you can only turn them. She rode hard at the point of the brake, shouting low and steady, swinging her soaked apron at their faces, crowding the leaders right and right and right, until the 40 steers bent and curved against their own panic in a long, wet arc. And she rode the inside of it and held them there, folding the brake back into the herd, where it milled and slowed and, under the singing of the other riders, settled. It had taken perhaps 90 seconds. It had felt like an hour. When it was done, Della sat her blowing mare in the rain in the dark, soaked to the bone, and found that her hands were perfectly steady on the reins, and her legs were shaking like a struck wire, which is the way courage actually works, whatever the stories say. Caleb came pounding up out of the dark, white-faced. "Della, you turned them. You put yourself right in front of—" "I'm all right," she said. "You could have gone down. They'd have. I didn't go down." She looked at him through the rain, and even here there was the ghost of dry humor in it. "I'm a hard woman to knock over, Mr. Mercer. Ask anybody." And Caleb, who had been about to be sick with fear in the saddle, let out a sound that was half a laugh and half something else, and reached across the gap between their horses and gripped her soaked arm, once hard, and let go, and they rode the edges of the settled herd together till the gray dawn came. When the dawn came wet and pale, and the herd was whole and grazing as if nothing had happened, Esau rode up beside her and took off his hat to her, just took it off and held it to his chest a moment. The old half-crow man, who had no reason on earth to defer to a soft white Dutch woman, and said only, "You'd have made a hand," which from Esau was a sonnet, and Della, who had been called a burden and a heifer and $15 of wasted passage, rode the rest of that wet morning sitting very tall. That night, the 5th, the last before Cheyenne, they camped on dry ground under a clearing sky, and the mood had changed, the way a camp changes after it has come through something together. Della cooked, and the men ate, but there was a different weather in it now, and after the plates were cleaned, Tom Becker, emboldened by the fire and the relief of being nearly through, said the thing the whole camp had been thinking. "Ma'am, I've got to ask it." He turned his cup in his hands. "When you put yourself in front of those steers last night, weren't you scared?" Della was quiet a moment, looking into the fire. "I've been scared my whole life, Tom," she said, "of rooms full of people, of the looks, of what folks say when I walk past." She set a stick into the fire. 40 steers in the dark isn't anything next to walking into a church social. At least the steers don't laugh at you. And the men laughed, but with her, not at her, and across the fire Caleb was not laughing at all. He was watching the plain, round, honest face of a woman who had just said, lightly, the truest, hardest thing in the world, and the thing in his chest that had no name, finally that night found one ear, though he did not say it out loud, not yet, not for another night and a Cheyenne street. They came down into Cheyenne on the evening of the 6th day, the 25th of October, trail filthy and triumphant, 348 head. They had lost 2 on the trail, to a snake and a broken leg, and Della had grieved those as well, and sold them at the yards the next morning for $31 a head for the prime and $28 for the rest. And when the buyer counted the money into Caleb's hand, it came to $10,100 and some dollars, more than he had seen in his whole life, and he stood there holding it and could not for a moment understand what he was looking at. He paid the four men first, double what Della had promised, and shook each of their hands, and Tom Becker, the shy one, ducked his head, and Esau put his hat back on and nodded once and was gone. And then Caleb stood in the Cheyenne street with $8,000 and some dollars left after the wages, and turned to Della, who stood in the cold sun in her travel-filthy blue dress looking at the railhead and the money and the whole impossible fact of it. And he said hoarse, "We did it." "You did it?" she said. "No?" Caleb Mercer shook his head, slow and certain, the most certain he had been about anything since the graves. "I had 3 graves and a black sleeve, and I'd lain down to die, Della. You walked up my road, and you put me back on my feet whether I wanted it or not." He looked down at the money in his hands, and then up at her face, the round, kind, weary face he had stopped somewhere in the last 6 days, seeing is plain. "I don't know what I am to you. We signed a paper is all, and Garrow signed it for the both of us to ruin me. But I know what you are to me, near enough. And whatever happens with that note and that man, I'm not letting you ride out of my life when it's done. I'll say that part plain now, in the daylight, sober, so you know I mean it." He stopped and looked at his boots, this man who never wasted words, having just spent more of them at once than in the whole month before. There, that said. Della stood in the Cheyenne street and looked at him, and for the first time in the whole story, she did not have a single competent thing to do with her hands, and they hung at her sides, and her round face, which had stayed calm through the poison and the storm and the drive, did not stay calm now. Her eyes filled. 26 years, a large plain woman, in a hard world, sold and mocked, and never once chosen. And here was this lean, weathered man with $8,000 in his fist and a black band on his sleeve, choosing her in the daylight, sober, plain. "That's a foolish thing to say to a woman in the middle of a stockyard," she said when she could speak, and her voice broke right across the middle of it. "I'm a foolish man," Caleb said. "I'm learning." And they stood there in the cold Cheyenne sun, the two of them not touching, the whole hard road to the 1st of November still ahead of them. But something had been settled that no note and no creditor could ever unsettle again, and Della carried it back north like a warm coal in her chest, all the long, cold ride home, where Royce Garrow still sat in his bank, soft hands folded, believing he had won. They got back to the ranch on the 30th of October. The 1st of November was 2 days off. Garrow had not been idle. They saw it the moment they came up the road. Fresh sign of many horses in the yard, Hollis Pruitt lounging at their own corral rail like he owned it, and a paper nailed to their own door. Caleb swung down and tore it loose and read it, and his face went hard, and he handed it to Della without a word. It was a notice of distraint, under the county seal and Sheriff Dwyer's signature, declaring the Mercer note in default of the conditions of good husbandry, the cattle removed and the land left untended, which Garrow's man had reported as abandonment. So the bank was exercising its right to seize the secured property ahead of the maturity date. In plain words, Garrow had seen the herd gone, had not understood they had sold it to pay him, had assumed Caleb was running, and had moved to grab the empty land 2 days early. It was a lie wrapped in legal paper, and Hollis Pruitt and 3 other Garrow men were sitting on it. "He thinks we ran," Della said softly, reading it. He saw the herd gone, and he thought Caleb skipped out on the note, and he's seizing the land before the first, so there's nothing for us to come back to." She lowered the paper. "He doesn't know we sold them. He doesn't know we've got his money." A slow thing moved across her tired face that was not quite a smile, and was something harder and cleaner. "Mr. Mercer, I do believe Royce Garrow has just reached too far in the dark and put his hand right where we can shut it in the door. There's 4 of them on my land, Della." "Then we don't fight 4 men," she said. "We pay a note." She folded the lying paper small and put it in her apron pocket with the others. "Tomorrow's the 31st. The note's due the 1st. He can post all the notices he likes. He can't take a thing for a debt that isn't due yet. And the second we lay the money on his desk, the debt's gone, and his seizures just 4 men trespassing on a paid-up ranch. He's hung himself on his own greed 2 days early." She looked at Pruitt, lounging on the rail, and raised her voice. Pleasant carrying. "Mr. Pruitt, you and your friends are welcome to sit my corral as long as you like. There'll be coffee at the house in the morning, and a federal land agent in Ashford before the week's out, and I'd hate for any of you to miss the show on account of a head cold from sitting out in the wet." Hollis Pruitt's grin slipped. He did not know what she meant. But he had been in this county long enough to know that the words "federal land agent" were not words a man on Garrow's payroll ever wanted to hear in the mouth of a woman who looked as calm as that one looked. And he sat there on the rail and felt the first cold draft of a wind that was about to change, and could not, for the life of him, say why. The 1st of November came up cold and bright. Caleb and Della drove into Ashford with $800 in a flour sack between them, counted 3 times, and the rest of the Cheyenne money sewn into Della's coat, and they came up the main street of the town that had laughed at them, and the town, by that country telegraph that needs no wires, knew something was happening and came out onto the boardwalks to see. Word of a mail-order bride digging a dead spring back to life had got around, and of a cattle drive nobody thought could be done, and faintest and most dangerous, that a federal man had been sent for East us, and it had cracked the smooth surface of Garrow's County, and people came out to watch. They stopped the wagon in front of the bank. Garrow was already there, on the steps in his good wool coat with Sheriff Dwyer beside him, fat and uneasy, and Hollis Pruitt and the others ranged behind, because he had ridden in expecting to formalize a seizure, and instead found half the town turned out. And a man like Garrow can always smell a shift in the weather even when he cannot name it, and his round face was not quite as comfortable as it liked to be. "Mercer," Garrow said, and his voice was loud, performing for the boardwalk, getting ahead of it. "You've a deal of nerve riding into town. The bank seized your property for abandonment and default. You ran your cattle off in the night." "I drove them to Cheyenne," Caleb said, "and sold them." And his voice was quiet, and it carried farther than Garrow's loud one, the way a true thing carries farther than a false one. "To pay you what I owe, to the dollar, on the day it's due." And Della climbed down off the wagon, slow, careful, 270 pounds of her in the cold, bright sun, in front of the whole watching town, and lifted the flour sack down after her, and walked up to the bank steps where Royce Garrow stood, and set the sack on the bottom step at his polished boots, and opened the neck of it so the morning light fell on the money inside. $800, Mr. Garrow," she said, plain and clear, so the boardwalk could hear every word. "Principal and your interest. The note's paid. Count it if you like. Folks'll wait." The street went very quiet. Royce Garrow looked at the money at his feet, and the smooth came off his face for just a moment, the way it had when he saw the dry trough, except backward now, a flash of something raw and disbelieving, and the watching town saw it, and you cannot unsee a thing like that once a town has. Then he smoothed it down fast and laughed, a forced fat laugh, and said, "Where would a ruined man get $800 in a week? This is stolen money or a trick. Sheriff, it's cattle money," said a slow, careful voice from the edge of the crowd, "and I helped drive it, and so did 3 other men this town knows, and the Cheyenne buyer's name is Amos Hartwell, and you can wire him." Esau stepped his pony forward out of the crowd, unhurried, and the 3 Homestead men were there beside him, ranged quiet behind Caleb now, and the town saw that too, saw that the bride and the broken widower were not alone, that honest men had come to stand with them in the open, and that was a thing that had not happened against Royce Garrow in 15 years, and the boardwalk drew its breath. "Take the money, Garrow," Caleb said. "Take it and mark the note paid in front of these folks, and then take your men off my land. The debt's done." And Royce Garrow stood on the bank steps with $800 at his feet and a town watching, and the whole of his patient evil suddenly slipping through his soft fingers. And he made the mistake men like him always make at the end, the mistake of a man who has never been told no and does not know how to hear it. He reached for the sheriff instead of the money. "That herd was mine," he said, too loud now, the performance cracking. "That herd was secured property. It was the bank's the moment that note was signed. He'd no right to sell it, Dwyer. Arrest him. He sold property under lien. That's theft. Take him—" "That's a strange thing to say, Mr. Garrow," said Delavos. She said it quietly, but the whole street heard, because the whole street had gone silent to listen to this woman they had measured by the pound, and now she had the floor, and she was not going to waste it. "You say the herd was the bank's. You say it was secured and worth seizing and worth fighting over." She took a step up onto the second stair, closer to him, her round face calm as still water. "That's a herd you've spent all autumn telling Mr. Mercer was as good as dead. A herd you wrote in your own seizure notice was abandoned and worthless. A herd you watched starve at a dry trough and called a hard year and a failed spring and a sky that wouldn't rain." She let it sit one heartbeat. Funny how worthless dying cattle turn back into the bank's valuable property the minute they walk to Cheyenne fat and sound and pay your note. Almost like you knew all along they could have been fat and sound. Almost like the only thing keeping them dying was something you did to the water. "That's slander," Garrow said, and there was sweat on his pale, fleshy face now in the cold air. "That's a mad woman's slander, you fat." "The spring on the Mercer High pasture didn't fail, Mr. Garrow." Della's voice never rose. "It did not have to. It was choked, packed shut with quarried stone, the kind a man hauls up a hill on purpose. I dug it out with my own 2 hands, and I kept the stone." She reached into her apron, and her hand came out with something smaller and worse, and she held it up into the cold, bright light where the whole town could see it. A single, empty stoneware crock, the freight office mark plain on its side. And when the spring ran clean again and the herd started to fatten, somebody came up in the night and fed poison into the water upstream of the cattle and killed 6 head, and I dug these out of the channel bank where he buried them." She turned the crock so the mark caught the light. "Bought at the Ashford freight office, Mr. Garrow. Your freight office. There's only one outfit in this county buys this poison by the crock, and every soul on this street knows whose it is." The silence on the street was total now. Sheriff Dwyer had gone a sick gray color and was looking at the crock like it might bite him. "I'm a simple woman," Delavaugh said, and now, only now, the smallest, hardest edge of a smile touched her plain, round face. "Too simple to invent a lie this size. That's what you'd say, isn't it? So I didn't take it to the sheriff, who I'm told is a friend of yours. I wrote it all down plain, the stone and the poison and the crocks and the dead cattle and the note. And I signed my own simple name to it, and I sent it near 3 weeks ago to the United States land agent at the territorial seat. Because poisoning a watercourse that runs down into the Crooked Fork and on past 3 other outfits, and this whole town's wells is a federal matter, Mr. Garrow, and the federal man does not bank with you." She put the crock back in her apron, gentle, like the evidence it was. "He'll be in Ashford this week. I'd stay close to home, if I were you." And Royce Garrow broke. It was not loud. The truly damning things never are. He looked at the crock and the money and the silent town and the 4 honest men and the gray, sweating sheriff who would, every soul present suddenly understood, sell him out by sundown the moment a federal badge rode into town, and the smooth confidence that had ruled this county for 15 years drained out of his face and left something small and trapped and ugly behind it, and he took a step back, up the stairs, away from the money and the crock and the woman, and said, in a voice gone thin, "Dwyer, do something." "I don't believe I will, Mr. Garrow," said Sheriff Dwyer, who could read the weather, too, and had just felt it change for good, and was already, in the way of small, frightened men, calculating which side of the federal land agent he wanted to stand on. He bent with a grunt and picked up the flour sack and held it out to Caleb. "Your money, Mercer. I'd hang on to your receipt." He looked at Garrow, and there was no friendship left in his fat face, only a cold animal sense of where the bodies were about to fall. "Mark the note paid, Royce, in front of these folks, like the man said." Royce Garrow marked the note paid. His soft hand shook so badly he blotted the ledger there on the bank steps with the whole town watching, and he could not look up while he did it, and when it was done he closed the book and went into his bank and shut the door, and that was the last the open street ever saw of him standing tall. The town did not cheer. It was too stunned and too ashamed of its own long silence. It only watched the bank door close, and then began, in 2s and 3s, to remember it had somewhere to be. Caleb folded the paid note into his shirt and stood looking at the shut door a moment, and then at Della, who had stepped back down into the street and was tucking the empty flour sack under her arm as plainly as if she had come to town for eggs. "You did that," he said, low, "only for her? All of it? The spring, the herd, the letter? I'd have signed his paper in September and walked off this country with my hat in my hand." "You'd have done no such thing," Della said. "You'd have stood on your 3 graves till he had to drag you off." She looked at the door, then at him. "But you didn't have to. That's the part I came for, Mr. Mercer, not to save you. Just to stand where a person could see you weren't alone." She started for the wagon. Now buy me a sack of real coffee out of your own money, and let's go home and water your cattle. The show's over." And Caleb Mercer laughed out loud in the open street before the whole town that had watched him grieve for a year, and went and bought the coffee. The federal land agent rode into Ashford 4 days later, a spare, unhurried man named Whitfield, with a marshal at his side, and Della handed him 3 crocks, a written account, and an honest old horsebreaker who could read the ground, and Sheriff Dwyer, saving his own neck, handed over the freight office books that charged the poison to Garrow's account. The fouled water had crossed onto public range and run toward the town wells, enough to put a federal man's nose in, but it was the frauds underneath that finished Garrow. The forged seizure, the juggled notes, 15 years of a soft white thumb on a whole county, unspooling that winter like rot out of a turned log. They did not hang him, and Della was not sorry, having grieved 6 steers and 3 graves and not needing a man's neck on top of it. But he lost the bank and the notes and the freight office and the county, and went east on a train in the spring, a broken man nobody feared any more, and the county he left let out a breath it had held for 15 years and began slowly to stand up straight. That winter, the Mercer Ranch did not just survive. It grew. The freed spring ran all winter, cold and steady, the only sure water for 40 miles in a country still parched, and that single fact changed everything. When Garrow's seized lands and ruined notes came up at the territorial auction that spring, it was Caleb Mercer who had the cattle money and the water to buy them parcel by parcel. The very land Garrow had spent 15 years stealing, bought back honest and handed to the families who had worked it. And the herd, watered and bred careful through a good wet spring that finally came multiplied. 400 head, then 600, then by the second autumn, more than 1,000 sound fat cattle wearing the Mercer brand across more watered grass than any outfit in the territory. The same dying ranch, a soft, rich man had bought a bride to break, grown by the woman he sent to break it into the largest cattle empire the country had ever seen. There was a morning that January that told the whole of what the place had become. A homesteader named Coyle came up the road through a foot of snow with his hat in his hands, a man who had stood at the saloon rail that autumn and laughed with Hollis Pruitt at the prize heifer on the Mercer wagon, and now his stock pond was frozen to the mud and his cattle were licking ice. He stopped his thin team at the corral and did not get down because he did not think he had the right to. Della came out onto the porch, wrapped against the cold, and looked at him a while. "Coyle," she said, "your water's gone." "Frozen out," he said to his hands, "clean to the bottom. I wouldn't have come, only—" He stopped. "I said a thing about you once, ma'am. In town. I expect you heard of it." "I heard of it." Della came down off the porch into the snow and put her hand on the nearest horse's frost-rimed neck. "Bring them up the east track to the high water. It runs deep and live off the spring and won't lock up the way a still pond does, and there's more of it than my cattle can drink." She looked up at him, no edge in it at all. "You'll find the gate open. It stays open. You don't have to ask me twice, and you don't have to take your hat off to me to get a drink for a thirsty animal. Nobody does on this place. That's the whole point of the place." Coyle's face worked, and he could not say anything for a moment. Then he got out. "Why? After what Because the man who choked this country's water to make himself rich is gone," Della said. and I dug it back up. Seems a poor way to thank the water, turning around and doing his trick over again with my own gate." She stepped back. "Go on. Water your stock. And when the thaw comes and you've got it to spare, do the same for the next man whose pond goes dry. That's all I'll ever ask of anybody for it." And Coyle drove his team up the east track with his hat still on his head because she had told him to keep it there. And he was one of 40 men that hard winter who learned that the water on the Mercer place ran for anybody, and that the woman the county had once weighed on its scale of contempt did not, now that she held the only water for 40 miles, weigh anybody on hers. Hollis Pruitt left the county. He turned up 2 years later working a hard, poor outfit 300 miles south, and when a man there asked him had he ever known the famous Mercer outfit up north, the one the big Voss woman built, Hollis Pruitt got quiet and said he'd worked nearby it once and changed the subject, and did not mention the prize heifer remark to anyone ever again as long as he lived. But none of the cattle or the land or the empire is the thing this story is finally about, and Della would be the first to tell you so. The thing it is about happened on a soft evening in the second spring. On the high pasture above the spring she had brought back from the dead. Caleb had been building something up there all that spring. He would not say what. He went up after the day's work with a wagon of milled lumber and a closed look on his face, and Della, who had learned to let a quiet man keep his quiet, did not ask. And on the soft evening it was finished, he took her by the hand. He had got easy now in 2 years, with taking her hand, the weathered one closing over the big mud-roughened one as the most natural thing in the world, and led her up the hill in the long gold light to see. It was a house, a second house, small and sound and well-made, set on the rise above the spring, looking out over the whole green-watered valley they had built, with a stone chimney and a deep porch and a wide, costly window, glass hauled all the way from Cheyenne, set deliberate into the north wall, where a window does a house no practical good at all. Della stood in the doorway of it and looked around at the clean-swept rooms that smelled of new pine, and she did not understand, and she looked at Caleb. "It's ours," he said, "yours and mine. I built it up here on purpose." He took off his hat. He took off his hat to her the way Esau had all those months ago, and he turned it in his hands the way he used to turn his coffee cup when he could not find the words, except he found them now. "I put that window in the north wall." He nodded at the wide, bright glass full of evening gold. "There's no sense in the north window, everybody'll tell you. Lets in no warmth, no morning sun, but you stand at it." She crossed to it, and stood at it, and looked out, and from that window, only from that window, you could see clear up the rise to the high stone basin where the spring ran silver in the gold light. The spring she had walked the dead land in the dark to find, the water that had saved them all. "So you can see the ridge where the water starts," Caleb Mercer said behind her, quiet, "every morning of your life, since you're the one that found it. Since you're the one that found all of it near enough, the water and the way out, and me where I was lying down to die." He stopped. His voice was not quite steady. "I had a wife I loved, and I buried her, and I never thought I'd want to say words like these to a living soul again. And I was wrong, and I've been wrong about everything that mattered since the day you came up my road, and I looked past you hoping for somebody smaller." He came and stood beside her at the north window, and they looked at the silver water together. "Della Voss, I'm not asking you to keep my house. You've kept it 2 years and built me an empire besides, and you could leave tomorrow, the richest woman in the territory, and I couldn't say a word against it." He turned to her. "I'm asking you to belong here, with me, not because a paper says so, because I choose you in the daylight, the way I should have from the first. You belong here, Della. Say you'll stay." And Della Voss, who had been sold across a continent to break a ruined man and had instead made him whole, stood at the north window in the long gold Montana light, with the man who had finally, truly seen her, and looked out at the silver spring she had dug out of the dark with her own 2 hands, and answered the only way that fit a woman of so few wasted words. "Yes," she said. That was all. One word, at the north window, with the water she had found running silver up on the ridge where the gold light lay. And the soft pink man who had bought her to break them both was gone east and forgotten, and the town that had laughed was quiet and grateful for its water, and the empire spread green across a country that had tried to die, and none of it mattered half so much to Della as that one word at that costly window, where for the first time in her dismissed and underestimated life somebody had chosen her openly in the daylight and built her a window to watch her own salvation run silver every morning for the rest of her days. But the marriage was only the door of it, and a story like this earns its long settling, so let me tell you what became of them all. They were married that summer by a circuit preacher in the green high pasture, with Esau standing up beside the groom and Tom Becker, and the homestead men and half the Grateful Valley crowded onto the grass, and Della Voss became Della Mercer, and ran the whole growing enterprise of it with the same plain competence she had carried up the road in a carpet-bag. She kept the books and bred the cattle careful and read the water and the weather, and the hard men of the territory who had begun by laughing at a mail-order bride came in time to ride a long way for the Voss woman's word on a spring gone uncertain or a herd that would not thrive. She never grew slim. She never tried to, and Caleb never once wished it. She stayed a large woman, broad and soft and round, with a wide, easy lap that 3 children, a girl and then 2 boys in time, would learn was the safest place in the whole watered valley. And Caleb, who had buried 2 sons behind the first house, held each new one and did not say much, the way he never said much, except that now there was no grief in the silence, only a man given back the thing he had lost. The 3 old graves on the rise were tended always, kept clear and planted with hardy bright flowers, because Della was not a woman who needed a man to forget his dead in order to love his living, and Sarah Mercer and her 2 small sons were spoken of in that house with kindness and never with fear, and the spring never failed again. Della saw to that, keeping it clear all her life and teaching her children to keep it clear after her, the way her ruined father had taught her the one true thing he ever knew, that water does not simply leave, and if you are patient and humble and put your hand on the ground will tell you where it has gone. She lived to be an old woman. She lived to see the territory become a state, and the Mercer brand known across it, and her grandchildren ride the green high pasture, and she lived every morning of all those long years to stand at the wide north window and look up the gold-lit rise to the silver water running, and to know, in the plain, unhurried certainty that had carried her up a dusty road into a dying ranch a lifetime before, that she had been worth every drop of it. And the creditor's letter, the very paper that had brought her west to be broken, Caleb kept it, folded soft as a love letter, in the desk in the north window house, because it was won in the end, the way the worst things sometimes turn all the way over and become the best. On their 30th spring, he took it out, worn near to lace, and read it to her one more time in the gold light at the north window, the cold, cruel words of the man who had meant to ruin them both. And they were not cruel any more. They could not hurt any more. They were only the first line of the long good story of how Della Voss came up a dusty road into a dying ranch, and built out of dead grass and broken stone and her own two underestimated hands the largest cattle empire the country ever knew, and was loved openly, in the daylight, to the end of her days, by the man who had once looked past her, hoping for someone smaller, and learned, too late to be sorry and just in time to be saved, that he had been looking all along straight at the only thing in that whole hard country worth keeping.